for years. He dedicated his teenage years to mastering it, waking early, staying late, repeating the same forms until they lived in his muscles rather than his memory. He built his entire identity around it, and then, without warning, without ceremony, he walked away. Not from martial arts, from the system that had made him. The real reason has never been fully told. And when you hear it, you'll understand that what Bruce Lee built next wasn't just a new fighting style. It was an act of rebellion against everything he had been taught to believe. Hong Kong, 1959. Bruce Lee left for the United States carrying everything Ip Man's school had given him. Wing Chun forms, Chi Sao sensitivity drills, centerline theory, the principle of simultaneous attack and defense. He carried it like a foundation, the bedrock on which he intended to build the rest of his life. He was 18 years old and completely certain about one thing. He knew how to fight. What he didn't know, and what the next 5 years would systematically dismantle, was whether the system he trusted so completely could handle every situation it would face in the real world. The answer, when it finally came, would change martial arts forever. But it would not come easily. And it would cost him something he never expected to lose. The first cracks appeared slowly. Lee began teaching in Seattle, gathering students who had no background in Wing Chun or Chinese martial arts of any kind. He watched them try to learn a system built for bodies and contexts very different from what he was now working with. And he began noticing something he couldn't ignore. Wing Chun was designed for a specific range, close quarters, inside the opponent's guard, hands working in tight linear patterns, the center line dominating everything. Against an opponent who cooperated with that range, who engaged at close distance and stayed there, it was devastatingly effective. Against an opponent who didn't, who circled, who moved in and out, who changed range unpredictably, the system showed gaps that the forms had never addressed. He started asking questions that Wing Chun had no answers for. And that was when everything began to unravel. He watched boxers, not casually, not as entertainment, but analytically, the way a scientist watches an experiment. He saw footwork that Wing Chun had never taught him. Muhammad Ali, whom he would later study obsessively through mirror sessions with fight footage, moved in a way that made close-range engagement nearly impossible for anyone trying to close the distance on him. Wing Chun assumed you could get close. Ali's footwork was built specifically to prevent that assumption from ever being tested. Lee began to understand that a system which assumed one range was a system with a ceiling built into it from the start. Then came 1964. Oakland, the locked room, Wong Jack Man. Most people know the broad outline. Few know what it actually cost Bruce Lee afterward, not physically, but philosophically. The fight, by his own private admission to people close to him, had lasted too long. He had relied on Wing Chun, his primary system, and found it insufficient against a resisting opponent who moved in ways the forms hadn't prepared him for. He felt winded in a way that shocked him. He had trained for years, was in exceptional physical condition, and had still found himself struggling in ways he hadn't anticipated. The Wing Chun he had trained didn't translate perfectly to this uncontrolled, unpredictable exchange against someone who wasn't cooperating with its assumptions. And if it couldn't handle that, then what exactly was he teaching his student? He went home and destroyed everything he thought he knew. Not literally, but close to it. He had a miniature tombstone made, a physical object he kept in his training space as a daily reminder. On it was written a single instruction to himself: to let go of anything that kept him rigid or limited his growth. The tombstone wasn't theatrical. It was functional. A man who understood how deeply the mind clings to familiar systems had built himself a tool to keep cutting through that clinging every single day. Because he understood something that most martial artists refuse to accept. The danger isn't in having the wrong system. The danger is in being so attached to your system that you can no longer see where it fails. He started from the ground up. Boxing for footwork and punching economy. Fencing for distance management, timing, and the concept of the stop hit. Intercepting an attack at its source rather than blocking and countering. Judo and wrestling for what happens when the distance collapses entirely and the fight goes to the ground. The range Wing Chun had no answer for. Taekwondo with Jun Ri for kicking range and power generation from the legs. He trained in disciplines that traditional Chinese martial arts considered beneath serious study. And he kept whatever worked and threw away whatever didn't, regardless of which system it came from or how long it had been considered sacred. What he was building had no name yet, but it had a principle, that the system serves the fighter, not the other way around. That any style, including the one you spent years learning, becomes a cage the moment you stop being willing to question it. In 1967, he wrote down the name for the first time in his personal daytimer. July 9th, Jeet Kune Do, the way of the intercepting fist. And in a letter written around the same period, in his own handwriting, he explained exactly why Wing Chun was no longer enough. He wrote that the reason he was not sticking to Wing Chun was because he sincerely felt this new approach had more to offer regarding efficiency. Not sentiment, not philosophy, efficiency. The word a man uses when he has tested something against reality and found the gap between what the system promised and what it could actually deliver. But here is the part that almost nobody knows, and it changes the story completely. Bruce Lee never actually abandoned Wing Chun. He transcended it. The centerline theory stayed. The simultaneous attack and defense stayed. The economy of motion stayed. The Chi Sao sensitivity, the principle of using minimal force efficiently rather than overwhelming power wastefully. All of it stayed, rebuilt into something that no longer looked like Wing Chun from the outside, but carried its essential logic inside every technique. He said publicly that Jeet Kune Do was not a style. It was the absence of style. The irony is that what he meant was that he had taken Wing Chun's deepest principle, the idea that you remove everything unnecessary and keep only what works, and applied it to Wing Chun itself. He closed his formal schools in 1971, 2 years before his death, because he had come to believe that the moment Jeet Kune Do became an institution, it would become the very thing he had left Wing Chun to escape. A system, a cage, a set of assumptions that students would follow without questioning because it was what their teacher had taught. He had spent 10 years dismantling one system to build another, and he wasn't willing to watch what he had built become the next thing a future student would need to dismantle. That is the real story of why he walked away from Wing Chun. Not because it failed him, because its deepest lesson succeeded so completely that it eventually consumed the system itself. He learned to let go of what limited him. And the first thing he let go of was Wing Chun. The last thing he let go of was Jeet Kune Do. And that final letting go was the most radical act of his entire career.